I call myself a software designer. Now, what you may ask, what software have I designed? Well, there's only one thing that I designed that you're familiar with, and that is called the back button. What's that, you say? It's obvious? Yeah, it's completely obvious. But in 1967, it was obvious to only one person in the world, and I had to fight for it.
Welcome to Interface Studies. My name is Saul. There's a small arrow in the top left corner of most browsers. It rarely draws attention to itself. It does not animate, does not persuade, and does not promise anything ambitious. Yet, if it stops working, the entire web might begin to feel a little bit unstable. The back button is one of the most heavily relied upon controls in digital history. Jacob Nielsen described it as the user's lifeline in early web usability research, noting that people depended on it to recover orientation in complex information spaces. Studies of browsing behavior in the 90s found that revisiting pages was not an edge case, but a dominant pattern. Later on, research demonstrated that users frequently returned to previous viewed pages as part of exploratory behavior, not simply to correct mistakes. The back button matters because the web's foundational data model was never structurally symmetrical. It was built on one-way links. Once you jump, the relationship between origin and destination disappears from the document layer, unless you reconstruct it yourself or unless an external system does that for you. The back button became the browser's structural compensation for that asymmetry. To understand why, the story must begin before the web existed. Vannevar Bush published As We May Think in The Atlantic in 1945. Bush argued that human thought proceeds by association rather than alphabetical hierarchy. He imagined the mimics, a theoretical electromechanical desk that will allow users to create associative trails through stored documents. The crucial idea there was not storage, but linkage. A researcher could follow a chain of references and then retrace that chain. The path itself became something that a researcher can manipulate. Navigation was no longer incidental. It was part of cognition. 2 decades later, Ted Nelson expanded this idea through Project Xanadu. Nelson described a docuverse in which links would be bidirectional and persistent. Every connection between documents would be visible from both ends. He also introduced transclusion, the inclusion of part of a document in another by reference rather than by copying. In such system, the notion of back would not require a system that compensates. The link itself would maintain its reciprocal structure. I spoke about both projects in a previous video about the history of graphical user interfaces. But Project Xanadu deserves its own, and is hopefully coming soon. Later on, the World Wide Web, invented by Tim Berners-Lee, adopted the linking model, but not the reciprocity. The World Wide Web is the most successful and perhaps the only information navigation system that is used globally today. HTML links are inherently unidirectional. A link from page A to page B creates no discoverable structural connection from B back to A. This simplicity made the web scalable and easy to implement, but it introduced a structural cost. Once a user navigated forward, the connection to the origin was not embedded in the document model. At the browser level, the user's context therefore became temporal rather than structural. It is encoded as order of pages visited rather than a persistent map of relationships. Structural context could still exist within a site through internal navigation, breadcrumbs, sitemaps, whatever. But the browser itself had no access to it. It could only track where you had been and in what sequence. That tracking mechanism was formalized in early browsers such as the NCSA Mosaic and later Netscape Navigator. They institutionalized the persistent back button on the toolbar, which we see to this day even with recently released browsers. Browser history operates as a stack, a last in, first out data structure in which each visited page is placed on top of the previous one. Pressing back removes the current page and reveals the prior state. This is not simply a convenience, it's an architectural decision. The browser history model encodes time as linear and destructive. If a user goes back several steps and then follows a new link, the forward history is erased. The system assumes a single, unfolding path. It is important to note here that it is the browser's history model, not the web as a whole, that enforces this hierarchy. The web's underlying protocol, HTTP, and the markup language, HTML, are stateless with respect to browsing sequence. The stack that we deal with today is a client-side construct layered over a system that has no native concept of where were you before. Other information systems demonstrate that the stack's assumption of linearity is not necessary. Git, which is a distributed version control system used primarily in software development, goes back to 2005, tracks changes to files over time, and it also allows users to move between versions without losing historical structure. Unlike a browser stack, Git stores history as a directed acyclic graph, or DAG. Past states can branch into multiple futures without overwriting one another. Reversal in Git does not require erasing what came after. History is persistent and nonlinear. The browser chose simplicity over structural completeness. Git chose structural completeness over simplicity. The back button reflects that trade-off, and so does Git's notorious difficulty for newcomers. Mobile operating systems reveal further divergence. The early versions of Android included a dedicated hardware back button managed by the operating system. This system-level control navigated temporally across screens and sometimes across applications, reinforcing the idea that navigation is primarily chronological. On the other side, iOS delegated navigation largely to the application layer. Apple's guidelines describe navigation controllers and gestures implemented within individual apps. Each application governed its own notion of back. Nowadays, modern Android and iOS have blurred this distinction considerably. Gesture-based navigation on both platforms mixes temporal and contextual signals. Android's predictive back gesture, introduced in Android 13, gives apps more control over their back behavior, moving towards an iOS model. And on iOS, the swipe from edge gesture can feel temporal even though it is app managed. The historical contrast here remains instructive. The binaries that we had in earlier systems no longer holds. What complicates things a bit more is that the web is no longer just for browsing information, and it can support powerful and modern applications. The browser's main navigation model still relies on an older understanding of it. In modern single-page applications, developers use the browser's History API to keep the URL and the visible interface in sync. Instead of fully reloading a document, the application updates parts of the page and selectively records certain transitions as history entries. When these state transitions are modeled poorly, either by recording too many small changes or by collapsing several meaningful steps into one, the back button behavior diverges from what users expect. People often rely more on in-app controls, such as tabs or close buttons, than on the global back button in browser in these app-like experiences, especially on mobile. The problem is not the back button itself. But the mismatch between a relatively simple, linear sequence of entries on the browser side and a much more richer, branching state machine on the application side. There's also a behavior element. As speed and browsers' capabilities increase, users just open new tabs and switch between them rather than just relying on going back. Modern browsers like Chrome, for example, kept the back button as it was since its inception and provide new solutions. For example, you can use the Detailed History tab and simply search. Or you can simply remember where you were by typing a few words in the Omni box and get back to it through autocomplete. Today, conversational AI systems introduce a more radical shift. Most chat interfaces implement history as a scrollable log rather than a navigable stack. There's no structural back here, only spatial displacement within an accumulating transcript. Without explicitly branching mechanisms, conversation history accumulates but does not structurally diverge. ChatGPT, for example, implements a fork conversation concept. It effectively introduces a Git-like approach into the dialogue interface. But this remains an exception rather than the norm. It also doesn't do a great job of it since the branched conversation sits on top of the conversation stack itself. The risk here is that navigation collapses into undifferentiated accumulation. Everything is recorded, but nothing can be visited again in a structural sense. The pattern across all these systems is consistent. The concept of back is not just an icon. It's almost a theory of time. The current norm in browsers is to have a linear destructive reversibility. The reasons behind that are historical. It was easier to implement from a computation perspective and cognitively tolerable. Git, on the other hand, introduced branching persistence because software development demanded structural memory. Mobile platforms had originally different approaches between temporal and contextual models. Conversational systems nowadays risk collapsing navigation into undifferentiated accumulation unless they adopt more explicit structural histories. The strategic implication is not about the arrow itself. It concerns how digital systems decide what kind of past is available to the user. A linear stack limits possibility to one unfolding narrative. A graph-like approach preserves alternatives. A log records everything, but does not navigate. The back button represents the minimum concession that made the web explorable at scale. And it was something from the old days of the web where things were way less complex. What replaces this linear back concept or augments it will determine whether future interfaces preserve structural memory or simply reduce history to scrolling.